All right, what's up, everybody? So we did not get a chance to do the last part of chapter 15 in class. So I'm going to try to clean that up real quick, get it done, and then you can watch it and good to go. This is a pretty critical piece of the conversation about Reconstruction because it really shows the extent to which the southern states, the former Confederate states, are going to be resistant to all the efforts of the radical Republicans in Reconstruction. So where we left off was, Reconstruction starting in 1865 in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? We had seen Lincoln have some ideas about what he wanted to do. He didn't live long enough to implement those. We saw some early radical Republican ideas about what they wanted to do, but Lincoln never signed those to make them law. We saw Andrew Johnson come in as president, and he basically just became a cheerleader for the Confederacy and let them get away with whatever they wanted to. And then finally, the radical Republicans came in and had enough members in Congress to be able to override any veto that Johnson had. And so they basically kind of had this tug of war with Johnson between the radical Republicans and Johnson over who actually was going to be in charge of Reconstruction. Johnson basically was letting the South get away with murder, quite literally, letting the KKK run wild. Letting the South set up black codes, giving a mass pardon to all of the Southerners, so on and so forth. The radical Republicans, who had a much more aggressive, or at least had any inclination whatsoever, but also quite aggressive towards ensuring equal rights for African Americans and punishing the Confederate leaders. They were aghast by Johnson's lack of action and by his blatant racism. And so they, again, got into this tug of war with Johnson over who gets to control it. Ultimately, the radical Republicans in Congress won that tug of war because, as I said, they had enough members in Congress to override Johnson's veto. So they would keep passing bills, Freedmen's Bureau bill, Civil Rights bill, so on and so forth. Johnson would veto them, and then they would override it. Obviously, the biggest accomplishments of the radical Republicans and of Reconstruction in general are the three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So, as I said, we're going to kind of pick up on part 3, where we see how where we see how the South is going to be resistant to actually abiding by any of those. And then we'll talk a little bit about why Reconstruction comes to an end. Okay, so we've already talked about the 13th Amendment a little bit. I'll come back to that momentarily. We've already talked about the 13th Amendment and the response by the Southern states. So the 13th Amendment says slavery, it's over, it's done, you can no longer have any slavery, except they kind of left a loophole in there, not intentionally, but they left a loophole in there that essentially said if someone's convicted of a crime and they're a prisoner, you can use them as slave labor. And so a lot of the southern states kind of pounced on that loophole and created a whole bunch of laws called black codes. Different states and jurisdictions had different ones, but the general idea behind the black codes was to prohibit the freedmen, the former slaves, from really having any freedom whatsoever, basically kind of like trap them in to basically still being slaves, right? We already went through these earlier in the lecture where it was like, it was illegal not to work. So if you were a vagrant, you can get arrested. If you were going to work, obviously the only job you were really skilled to do was to be an agricultural laborer. The person most likely to hire you was your former master, who's now your employer. They had laws that said if you work in agriculture, you had to work from sunup to sundown, and you weren't allowed to leave and go anywhere off of the plantation from sundown to sunup. So you were basically imprisoned on the plantation. So all of that basically adds up to being a slave. And of course, there's dozens and dozens of other laws that are meant to kind of restrict and constrain slaves from being able to do anything other than just continuing on in the same condition they were. So this is the South kind of very cleverly in their kind of insidious evil plans to their. Let me take a step back. The ultimate goal of the South, the lost cause, as it were, this glorious movement of the South after the Civil War, is to make sure post-Civil War South looks just like pre-Civil War South, to not actually give in, right? And so we talked about how the South was not necessarily kind of embarrassed by their loss, or they weren't going home with their tail between their legs or anything like that. They were even more emboldened. And so part of that, of course, is, like I said, is saying, okay, you outlawed slavery, technically, but here's the way that we're going to be able to maneuver around that. And then ultimately, the second half of the black codes is to have many excuses to arrest black men and throw them in prison, because once they're in prison, you could use them as slave labor, which again is that loophole in the 13th Amendment. So the radical Republicans accomplished something amazing. The 13th Amendment is phenomenal. It's one of the greatest pieces of the Constitution, and slavery once and for all. But the Southerners are like, okay, slavery's over, got it. Black codes basically force slaves to stay exactly where they are, or give us an opportunity or an excuse to throw hundreds of thousands of them in prison and use them as slave labor anyway. So that's the way that the radical Republicans, or I'm sorry, that's the way that the Confederate States kind of wiggled their way around the 13th Amendment. But the radical Republicans see this happening and they say, well, wait a minute, that's not what we meant, right? That is not what you were supposed to have done. So that encourages them or inspires them to create the 14th Amendment. First, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but then they passed the 14th Amendment, which basically accomplishes the same thing. So we talked about this earlier in the lecture as well. Basically, what the 14th Amendment does is say, look, everybody who's born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, right? So all former slaves are now automatically citizens, because that wasn't determined by the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment just said, okay, slavery's over, cool, that's it, but didn't really like give any other information about what was to become of everybody who used to be a slave. So the 14th Amendment kind of answers that question. So it says everybody who is born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. That's the first part of the 14th Amendment. The second part of the 14th Amendment is to say that you have to give every single citizen equal protection under the law. Equal protection under the law. In other words, you can't treat one group one way and a different group another way. Specifically aimed at those black codes. You can have a set of laws for white people and a different set of laws for black people. So the 14th Amendment made the black codes unconstitutional. And again, we talked earlier in our lecture about kind of the scope of what the 14th Amendment actually means, and how decade after decade after decade, over a century and a half later on, it's still relevant. It's still being used regularly to fight back against discriminatory policies throughout the United States, right? Fundamentally, what the Equal Protection Clause does, those 5 words, equal protection under the law, the Equal Protection Clause, it actually finally makes the Constitution live up to the Declaration of Independence, right? The Declaration of Independence, with the flowering language of all men are created equal, so on and so forth. Well, the original Constitution did not guarantee that. It will not be until the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is passed that we finally achieve that. So how does the South get around this? The South says, okay, so now they're coming after us, trying to undermine our black codes with this 14th Amendment. So what they look at is this word equal. What does that actually mean, right? So they say, okay, we have to treat everybody equally. So there's going to be white schools and black schools. That's equal. Everybody has an opportunity to go to school. Doesn't mean that we have to let black kids go to the same schools as white kids. And they just take that concept and kind of play it out throughout the rest of Southern society. And now you have segregation, in which black people aren't allowed to access many of the same things as white people are. Education is kind of the key one that's going to come up and have the biggest impact, and the one that we focus on the most, but it applies across the board to pretty much every aspect of society. And their argument is, technically this is equal. We're not saying that black people can't have whatever. We're just saying they can't share our version of it. They can have their own churches, their own schools, their own hospitals, their own newspapers. They just can't participate in ours. So most radical Republicans and most Southern blacks were like, okay, well, this is clearly blatantly a violation of the 14th Amendment. Like, you guys are trying to be cute, but no, sorry, this is a violation. So they take it to the Supreme Court. And the way it goes to the Supreme Court is there's a dude named Homer Plessy, who is 1/16th black and 15th, 16th white, right? So his DNA, his lineage is mostly white, but the law basically was, if you have one drop of black blood flowing through your veins, you're considered to be black. So he intentionally gets on a train on the white car. So he did like the Rosa Parks thing well before Rosa Parks did, and made it clear that he was actually technically black. And so he would get arrested. And so he could challenge this idea that there are white cars on trains and black cars on trains, right? Because fundamentally, we all know that as long as there is a white version of something and a black version of something in the South in the 1890s, that's not actually going to be equal. the black schools are not equal to the white schools, even just in their course offerings, right? The white schools kind of assumed that the students going there what may go into a professional job. So they need to learn all the things they need to be able to do to become an engineer or a surveyor or a lawyer or a doctor or physician, whatever. The classes that were taught at black schools were specifically to teach kids how to be sharecroppers, how to work in the fields, right? They didn't even give them the opportunity to learn the things, let alone the facilities were obviously in much worse condition. The teachers weren't trained. They didn't have textbooks. I mean, the black schools were obviously way worse than the white schools. And again, just allow that to kind of, you know, filter through the rest of society. Everything's going to be like that. So that was the case that was being made by Homer Plessy and by general African Americans and Northern Republicans generally, which is like, look, this is obviously unequal. So they challenged it in the Supreme Court through this case about the railroad train cars. And the Supreme Court unfortunately sided with the southern states, and they said, yes, separate but equal is constitutional, separate but equal. So you can have a white school and a black school as long as they're equal to one another. Separate but equal is constitutional under the 14th Amendment. And basically what that Supreme Court case did, Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the most important Supreme Court cases in the history of the United States, gave the legal constitutional blessing for segregation by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said segregation is totally fine. And the Jim Crow era, which is the era of black people being oppressed and discriminated against and treated as second-class citizens, which really starts in the 1870s, is going to be codified as law in the highest court of the land in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is a huge, huge blow to attempts at trying to bring equality between whites and blacks. Segregation, again, codified by Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, how about the 15th Amendment? The 15th Amendment was very clear. It says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race, skin color, or previous condition of servitude. So it gave the right to vote to all men in America, because you can't deny someone the right to vote because they're black or whatever. So the southern states are going to get very clever in their kind of evil efforts here to discriminate against black people. So some of the things that they come up with in order to actually disenfranchise black people is something like a poll tax. So you have to pay a tax or pay a fee when you register to vote. Well, most black men don't have any extra money lying around. Remember, most black men are sharecroppers. Most black men are in debt. And if they're spending money registering to vote rather than using that money to pay off their debt to their landlord, right, that's going to land them in jail. And so they were basically so poor that they weren't able to pay those poll taxes, and it disenfranchised them. Now, the South says, we're not denying you the right to vote because of your skin color, because of your previous condition of servitude, or because of your race. We're just saying you have to pay a poll tax. And this, by the way, as a side effect, also disenfranchises a lot of poor whites, but rich white people don't really care about that. Another example of kind of a clever way that these jerk faces deny the right to vote to black people in the South were literacy tests. Remember, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read or write. So right after slavery ended, a lot of African Americans weren't educated. Now we know a lot of them were becoming educated by the Freedmen's Bureau, and so these literacy tests became less effective over time. But basically what the literacy test did was, if somebody registered to vote, you'd give them a reading, and so you have to answer some questions about this reading. So if you're a former slave, you don't know how to read or write, and you show up and you say, hey, I want to register to vote, but I can't read, they're not going to let you register to vote. So yet again, they're going to deny you the chance to vote not based on your race, not based on your skin color, not based on your previous condition of servitude, but based on this literacy test. Now, again, they know this is going to disenfranchise most black people, and unfortunately, I guess, for a lot of poor white people as well. But again, they're not too concerned about that. They are disenfranchising the black vote. Probably the most clever in its simplicity and its stupidity is grandfather clauses. The grandfather clause basically says you're only allowed to vote if your grandfather could vote, which is stupid, but it's a law that was passed, and it technically wasn't a violation of the 15th Amendment. So we know everybody who was just newly freed from slavery, we know their grandparents could not vote, and so therefore they could not vote. And then also, subsequently, their grandkids would not be able to vote, and then also their grandkids, et cetera, et cetera. So the grandfather clause basically disenfranchises African Americans from voting forever and ever and ever, and technically doesn't violate the 15th Amendment because it's not based on their skin color, It's not based on their race, and it's not based technically on previous condition of servitude. All we're saying is if your grandpa couldn't vote, you can't vote either. Sorry, right? So all of these different methods were meant to disenfranchise voters, and they had ridiculous things too, like one of those things at the county fair where there's a jar full of beans, and you had to guess how many beans are in there or whatever. If you couldn't guess the number of beans in there, they wouldn't let you vote. Or I mean, these aren't jokes. They'd have a bar of soap and they get it all sudsed up, and they'd say, okay, how many bubbles are on this bar of soap? What? If you can't tell how many bubbles are on the bar of soap, then you're not registered. I mean, they come up with the most ridiculous ways of preventing people to register to vote. And of course, as we know, as we've discussed kind of throughout the lecture, if somehow none of those worked to prevent Black people from voting, the Ku Klux Klan was a white supremacist terrorist organization that was created in 1866, 1 year after the Civil War ends, 1 year after the 13th Amendment is passed. And they very quickly become a organization which is dedicated to violently repressing the Black vote, burning down homes, murdering people, standing outside of the polling place. And if any Black person decided to show up to vote, they would get dragged away and beaten, murdered probably, or they'd get taken inside and told how they were to vote. So the threat of violence from the KKK kind of also hovered over the entire kind of political system in the South, on top of all these other things that were going on. Now, let's remind ourselves that from 1867, when the Reconstruction Act was passed by the Radical Republicans, to 1877, when Ulysses Grant is no longer president of the United States, most of these things were stopped from happening because President Grant, Radical Republicans, and the Union Army were all on the same page as far as protecting the rights of Black people in the South. And in fact, President Grant created the Justice Department, which is the department that is responsible for being the federal government's law enforcement kind of arm, and the Union Army, and they actually demolished the Ku Klux Klan. They successfully destroyed the KKK during this time period, which sadly will reemerge in the 1920s, but they actually accomplished that goal. So this is a back and forth, right, between Radical Republicans and Grant and the Union Army trying to do everything they can to actually protect African Americans, while the South is going to do everything it can to either wiggle its way around the laws on technicalities or to use the threat of violence to scare African Americans into not actually practicing their rights to vote. Now, we know that during this time period, African Americans came out to vote in huge numbers. African Americans were elected to office, et cetera, et cetera. But after 1877, that's all going to come to an abrupt end. The question is, why does it all come to an end in 1877? Let me go back to a previous slide. There's going to be an economic collapse in 1873 in the United States. And we don't need to get into all the specific details, but it's basically because of overspeculation. It's always because of overspeculation. Basically, there's too much of one thing that's being produced. And so the price of that thing eventually drops because there's more of it than we need. And in this case, that thing was the railroad. We'll talk next chapter about how the Republicans spent tons of money on expanding the railroad system all across the country. And eventually it was too much. And then that basically dropped the value of railroads, which is kind of the lifeblood of the American economy. And that kind of destabilizes the entire American economy. All that is to say that there was an economic slide in 1873, and the Republicans have been in charge for a decade and a half. So they have no one to blame other than themselves. So the public is starting to lose confidence in the Republican leadership. And as that happens, the Republicans' attention kind of goes away from the South and away from radical republicanism and starts to focus more on just basically kind of survival, right? They're like, okay, we got to focus on the economy, we got to focus on getting reelected, and so on and so forth. And so the Southern kind of Reconstruction efforts become less of a priority. There's also a whole bunch of corruption in the Grant administration, not by the president himself. He was actually a very honest man. He was just a very bad judge of character. So he hired a lot of people who were very corrupt. And so stories started coming out about corruption in the Grant administration. All of this kind of just gave the Republicans a bad name. So they kind of start panicking about just politics and about getting reelected and staying in power. And as this is happening, many of the old kind of radical Republicans are either retiring from Congress or dying off or so on and so forth. So some of the voices that were most kind of vociferously arguing in favor of Reconstruction policies have left Congress. And as I said, the Republican Party's attention is being diverted elsewhere. So that brings us to the election of 1876. There's the Republican candidate is going to be a dude named Rutherford B. Hayes. Again, the names in the 1800s are amazing. Rutherford, Ulysses, Abraham, Thaddeus, just incredible. But Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican candidate. Samuel Tilden is the Democratic candidate. And what ends up happening in this election is that on election night and in the weeks after, no one really knows who won. There's a bunch of really shady stuff that goes down in this election. The Republican Party does a bunch of shady stuff. They still control Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. The rest of the South has basically been handed back to the Democrats, but they still control these three states. So in those three states, it becomes unclear who won because the Republicans are doing a bunch of shady stuff. So weeks go by and still we don't know who won. And it's approaching March when Grant has to leave the White House and be like, my term is over, and we still don't know who the next president's going to be. So a commission is formed, they debate it, they talk about it, they still can't figure out who it's going to be because all the Democrats say we won and all the Republicans say we won. So eventually, in early 1877, as we approach March, when the new president has to take office, a deal is made, a bargain is made between the Democrats and the Republicans. And the bargain is basically this. The Democrats will allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become president. They'll allow the Republican to take the White House. You get to be president as long as you promise that you will remove all of the Union troops from the South and you will give up on Reconstruction altogether. Well, by this point, the Republicans had kind of already lost interest in Reconstruction. You know, the economic collapse and the corruption and all this other stuff. And so they take the deal and they say, yeah, man, cool. Like, we'll take the White House and we'll end Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction will come to an end in 1877, mostly because the craven political interest of the Republican Party. So Rutherford B. Hayes will become president. He will withdraw all the troops from the South. Once all the troops are withdrawn from the South, that basically just ends Reconstruction and hands it back over to the Confederates, who are going to erase all of the progress that was made during Reconstruction and install the segregation we were talking about earlier, do all those shady things to avoid the 13th, 14th, the 15th Amendment that they were being stopped from doing by, President Grant and by the radical Republicans and by the Union Army, all of which are all gone now. And so the South is basically able to go back to the way that it was. And so this time period is going to be known in the South as the redemption. We are redeeming the South. We want to return the South to the way that it was before the Civil War, and they basically do. Technically, slavery is over. Technically, everybody's being treated equally. Technically, we're not violating the 15th Amendment, but we know what they're really doing. And that creates the Jim Crow era, which, as I said before, is going to last for about 70 years until we get to the 1950s and 1960s, where Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement will challenge it. So that's how Reconstruction ends. But for about 10 to 12 years, there was this glorious period in which the radical Republicans, President Grant, and the Union Army all worked to ensure that there was actually progress being made, that African Americans in the South were actually being protected and practicing their political rights and voting people into office. And then again, sadly, in 1877, it all comes to an end because of the bargain of 1877. And after that, the redemption, Jim Crow, KKK will return a couple of decades later on, and African Americans will be basically completely stripped of their rights altogether. So that's the end of chapter 15. Kind of a sad ending to kind of a fun chapter, but there you have it. And we'll see where this story goes later on. All righty.